Once he had his bags on the floor and his boots off, he sat down on the floor and sighed heavily in the cool air inside. It felt good to be out of the heat, though it was not too bad. It was mainly the humidity. Kyron ate his meal quickly and gathered his items into the bedroom to sit down on the bed and investigate today's findings. He pulled out both books that he retrieved, his sample gun, and the 3 frames containing photos that he was just itching to see. Which to look at first, though? He stared at them for a moment and decided he would try to decipher the journal later. Picking up the other book he grabbed, he opened it back to the page where the key had been stored, as he realized he had left it back at the cabin. He would grab it on his next go-around to see what else he had for him and what the other room had in store. He looked over the symbol again and wondered what significance it had been circled in red. Glancing back at the artist's drawing, he stared at it and tried to remember which creature this was. He knew it was in his booklet, but he thought he had memorized them all. Furrowing his brow, he grabbed his booklet and sat back down on the bed as he flipped through, looking for the creature drawn in the old book. Arriving near to the end of the booklet, he saw the page flip past where the resemblance was as he returned quickly back to it. The lurking shadow. He sighed loudly as he stared at the page and became frustrated that he found information on a cat black, but there was no way to read it. He couldn't look it up either, with no phone and no signal or anything of such. Slapping the booklet shut, he stared at the page and all of the intricate drawings around the pages and seemed to be a talented artist with their corner border designs. Amongst the circled symbol were many more, but why was this one circled, he wondered. Returning to the front of the book, he tried to peel several of the pages apart, but there were many stuck and tore easily. Coming across nearly 10 like this, he came across another that was accessible. More symbols were on the left page, while the right showed another symbol which looked just like a pollia or the vampire finch. A smaller sketch beside the detailed drawing was of the finch's mouth unhinged, showing its true face. The booklet they had given him had not been this detailed, but merely wrote of what it looked like. The sketch was nothing short of frightening to look at, to say the least. If only he could read what it said. He found a few more pages accessible, but cared little for them since they were mainly category greens. The inside backing of the book had something etched in it once he had reached the end. He ran his fingers gently across it and wished that he had something he could go off of to understand these things. Pursing his lips, he shut the book and placed it back in his bag securely before looking at the 3 framed photos. Kyron was able to locate some rubbing alcohol and cotton balls, brought them back into the bedroom, and started cleaning up the first one he had grabbed. The muck came off quickly and easily as he started at the top left and began working his way across around the frame's outer portions. As he drew closer to the center, he could see something jutting up like a church steeple. Fully cleaning off the glass, he looked at the image of an old small church on top of a grassy hill. The photo was definitely old, posing sepia brown tones and darkened edges. Turning the frame over, he carefully undid the backing and looked at the back of the photo bearing the rare cursive writing language, Pastor James. He whispered. There was no date nor area indicating where this was taken, but it must have been long gone by now. Lost in time with the rest of history to remain a mystery, and eventually all memories, including the tangible ones, will become nothing, returning into the world from which they came. The person who lived at the cabin must have been religious, or perhaps was an old relative. Carefully placing the frame back on it, he set it aside and began working on the next photo. This one revealed what appeared to be farmland with many trees organized, single-file lines, crops growing beside the last row, and an old man standing near a wheelbarrow full of something, but it was covered by something. The old man sported many years on his face, lines of hardship, and had a long pipe hanging from his lips, from what Kyron could see. On the edge of the photo, before the blackened corners took over, were 3 lanky boys standing near a fence, with their hands in their pockets, looking away from the photo. Opening the back of the frame, he read off, St. Andreas Farm. But of course it bore no location or date either. Kyron set this one back first, and then took the last one in hand and cleaned it up. The The final photo was of a girl that appeared to be in her early to mid-30s, standing in front of a forest. Her long dark hair flowed down her breast and nearly to her navel with an apathetic expression. In the forest, it seemed foggy, but it could have been the quality of the photo and had faded in time. As he looked closely, he thought he could see faces in the fog, but each time he blinked, he no longer saw them. Returning to the girl, her eyes were completely different than before. They were wide and wild-looking, like someone who had lost their mind. Opening the back, he read, Anima Devorator. He knew it was an old language, but he had never studied it. Placing the back on, he flipped the photo back over and saw that the girl was smiling, laughing almost. Furrowing his brow, he asked himself if he needed some sleep. It had been a long and productive day after all. He would return to these another time. Placing the last with the other two, he shut the lights off and settled himself into the makeshift bed with the stale comforters from the bedroom's closet. As he was beginning to drift off, he had a thought that simmered out before he could reach any alarm or conclusion. Why was the first facility's door locked but not this one? The following day, he made himself breakfast and sat down on the floor in front of the one-way glass covering the back wall. As he ate, he stared at the foliage and the trees, studying how they looked somewhat different than at the first facility. Digging his map from his pocket, he looked over it while shoveling food into his mouth. He glanced over it and looked at the area around where he was, and if there seemed to be any landmarks. However, once someone made it this far, not much other information was gathered to display what might be ahead of him. He tried to backtrack to where he thought the cabin was and hoped he could find it again today. It was about an hour or so away, if he remembered correctly. Today's visit would be more thorough, but dreaded the walk through the water. Too much uranium can make humans ill. He made a light dotted line on the map from where he was to the area he recalled the cabin being in, and then circled it. Perhaps he could find some more books that were salvageable. There could even be priceless artifacts stored in the ruins of someone's forgotten homestead. He reminded himself he could also come across the black mold and other harmful, invisible spores he needed to watch out for. Breakfast was eaten, the bags were packed and ready to go, the book he located, and the photos he left back at the facility to have more room to bring other items back and compare what might be worthy of keeping. The trek from the facility to the cabin was quiet and peaceful, other than the occasional cricket chirping or buzzing of an insect. He came across cat-green plants that he had yesterday and knew he must be on the right track while creatures were absent. Arriving back at the cabin, he was careful not to slide on the moss and murk as he entered inside. In the bedroom to the right, he chose to visit first to look through all of the books to find if there were any in decent condition. He sorted through all the books as he placed all of the ruined books aside. 2 were found that were somewhat able to be opened, but only a few pages, while the others were stuck together. Placing these in his bag, he looked around the rest of the room, in the bedding that reeked of a carcass, the side table that he had forgotten yesterday, and the walls. The side table had a tiny lockbox in it, but there was no key within sight. He then recalled that the key in the book that he had dropped yesterday, and began searching around for it, but never seemed to locate it. Assuming it may have fallen through the floorboards into the swamp, he placed the tiny box in his bag to review later. Carefully making his way across the cabin, he looked through the kitchen area and saw rather interesting tools, but decided not to bring them back with him. The cabinets were empty, all but a large beat-up kettle and a metal cup. The living room area had nothing to see and was essentially bare. Now, onto the final room. The door latch crumbled to the floor when he pulled it, as the door creaked open and came off the hinges, falling to the floor with a loud thud and a dusty bang. He jumped back as he covered his eyes, realizing right away the mistake he made as he slid on the soggy ground. He fell to the floor, sliding towards the water pulled at the back of the cabin. Grabbing the door frame, he sighed and tried to blink away the dust still floating around his face. He regained his footing, but scolded himself internally for being an idiot. Returning his eyes to the room, he felt static flowing from his fingertips into his chest as his jaw dropped slightly. Before him on the far wall was roping that was twined into intricate designs and stretched across it. In the center was a small circle of a thicker substance. Throughout the webbing were small items tied to the roping. One he noticed was a bird skull. Another that could be seen from where he stood was a large black feather speckled in tiny red dots. There was an array of items tied to the web, but nothing sat in the center of the thick circle. To the right of the room were 2 bookshelves, with all their books still sitting perfectly in place. The room was untouched by water somehow. Everything in the room was dry as sand. He had not noticed before, but should have been curious as to why the dust flew up in the swamp-sunken cabin. But why? He set his foot carefully down on the dry boards and saw a line where the door had been, separating the moss-ridden floorboards from the ones that were bone dry. The room was not completely sealed off, but there was still a perfectly straight line between the rooms. Furrowing his brow, he saw there was only one window and unshattered in this room. He wondered if this could have been it. It still felt off, however. The boards creaked as he moved around the room, gazing at all the perfectly preserved antiques. Along the bookshelves on the wall to his right bore a plethora of items that seemed to be as though they were in perfect condition and had been untainted by time. Candles sat in frozen pools of wax, like statues jutting from the excess they shed with their tired, burnt wicks sitting atop their deformed heads. Jars filled with clear liquid as a small creature sat curled at the bottom of the glass, sustained in an oxygenless chamber. Books lined the shelves, some leather-bound and appeared as the typical reading source, while some of the others seemed to be homemade with everyday materials, woven together with string and careful craftsmanship, none of which seemed to have been created sloppily and with little care. Among the books and jars sat rocks of different shades and sizes, some glittering with crystal specks, reflecting the sun coming through the single window, casting beads of light along the room and the other atoms. On the wall on the far left, where the window was set, was a large desk with many drawers and cabinets. Small crevices created into the shelf made their home in the left and right upper portions of the table. Amongst the closed-off ink bottles and quills setting in an organized fashion next to an open book in front of a chair. Upon further inspection, the open book had tidy but microscopic writing inside that seemed to be the same language as the other books discovered the previous day. Moving his eyes from the book to the small inkwells, there was a realization that they were not all black, but one sat alone and away from the others in red. Furrowing his brow, he looked back at the open pages and recognized the same symbol from yesterday that had been circled in a faded red. What was the page to the right of it? He could not recall. He had left it back at the facility in order to keep it lighter when exploring the unknowns at his leisure, though determined by the sun and how forth-giving it was with its light. Taking the page carefully in his fingers, he turned it to the pages before, displaying neat writing in perfectly straight lines, despite the paper bearing no lines for organizational assistance. All 32 pages were completely filled with writing, with some having larger sketches of symbols amongst the smaller ones. On the inside portion of the cover was a signature, he was sure, from its formality and placement. Wolfram Korkitska. Why does this name feel familiar and yet none at all? Chiron decided on taking this book and examining it further back at his temporary home. After placing this in the bag, he looked up and examined the smaller bottles on the shelves around the desk where the book sat upon. These small bottles were labeled in clear English, with each glass sealed with a basic cork, containing each item it was displayed as. Most were basic herbs found commonly around the world, such as thyme, oregano, salt, and rosemary. The others amongst the ordinary ones had some he had only heard of, but not actually seen, tasted, or smelled himself, such as pygmy borage, feverfew, and winter savory. The remaining ones were items he had never heard before: beniformicea, hydroxyzine, clextorniforicol, morphinum, The particular jars looked nearly identical, with it appearing as finely grated flour or solid white with no granules or impurities. He assumed it was best to not meddle with herbs and spices that he was not familiar with, as they could be poison. Gazing back at the bookshelf behind him, he listened to the boards groan softly beneath him. As he approached the shelf, he noticed a fly come buzzing through the door in its chaotic winding manner, as it wove around Chiron several times before it departed from his waving hands. He turned to see where it was when he finally spotted it on the floor in front of the desk, just below the chair. Stepping slowly to not disturb the boards, he made his way back over to where the fly was, as he crouched down and noticed something he hadn't seen before. Under the desk, hidden by the chair, was what appeared to be a latched door to a basement area. Finding this rather odd, as this cabin did not look as though it had such a thing, he decided to have a better look. He crawled to the desk and removed the chair as the fly took off and left the room. He felt the air under the desk to be much colder than in the humid forest weather. Perhaps it was the pond the cabin sat in, but this was not plausible either. He had waded through the waters, and they were not cold nor cool. Moving his hand closer to the latch, it grew colder until he realized the door seemed to be sparkling. No, it was ice. There were sections of ice on the latch itself, freezing the handle portion to the wooden piece. The fly flew back into the room with its annoying buzzing as it came across Chiron and landed on the latch door. Its wings began to flutter almost immediately after it had landed, but it never moved. It buzzed with effort, but then slowed within a matter of seconds before it stopped, watching the microscopic ice crystals begin covering its body. Chiron removed his hand from beneath the desk as he stood there and stared at the door with a strange feeling in his stomach. He was in an alien world, sure, but this seemed completely out of place. Something about that door was unnatural. He removed his sample gun from its holster and scanned the latch door. Scrolling down the screen, past the wood and the age of the wood, which was just older than the cabin's read, he noticed something even odder. The temperature of the door was reading negative 99.7 Fahrenheit, or negative 73.17 Celsius, which is almost the same temperature as dry ice. His eyes gazed at the screen in disbelief, though he had come to learn that this thing was the most accurate tool he had ever come across. What could possibly be this cold enough to freeze a fly before it could lift off, in the middle of a humid forest? Placing the gun back in its holster, he stood to see an older man standing in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" the old man grumbled. Sporting a straw sun hat, the shade covers his eyes for the most part, but it was evident in the deep lines around his frown that he was not pleased. Chiron's eyes grew wide as he looked the man over, then back to his face again. The shock of finding another person here was beyond any type of belief, and into single-person powered conspiracy theory. Gray stubble peppered his chin, and the 5 o'clock shadow dug deep into the lines of the unhappiness he wore on his tanned and tired skin. A handkerchief was loosely tied around his neck, leading down to a dirty white t-shirt and a pair of faded, torn jeans. I thought there were no people living here," Chiron said shakily. The utter shock of seeing another person in a place claimed to be completely uninhabited by humans caused his blood to not only boil, but to also feel as though it was coagulating at the same time. "You're damn wrong, son. I live here." How? What you mean, how? I come inside and go to bed and sleep at night, like all folk do. I mean, I thought the Continental Divide was completely bare of humans. Then what are you doing here, son? He asked with a snarky air as he raised his gnarled hand, gesturing to Chiron with what almost seemed like a smirk on his face. "I was sent on a mission." An unsettled, gut-wrenching feeling came about, as his conscience asked if his statement was a mistake. "Mission, huh?" the old man said as he slowly paced the floor, with his fingers rubbing against his chin. The old man raised his head enough to see past the shade of the sun hat at the piercing blue eyes that stared at Chiron. Chiron said nothing. "Not so much up for talking now, are you?" the old man crooned. "Who are you?" Chiron nearly breathed. "I'm nobody. Now at least. Used to be somebody." "Used to?" "Shoot, yeah, I did. I was a father, and I was a husband at one point,
And nah, I didn't kill him. I seen that look in your eye. No, something else took him away from me. Something that was much more powerful than I could fight against.
Such as...
Such as a goddamn ripping time, that's what.
What? Chiron was beginning to feel as though he had come across a man who had lost his mind and could be in danger. Is this why they had the facility doors locked? Wait, the second one was not, and this is closer to the cabin than the first.
Damn right. Why you think all these impossible creatures are flashing about here?
He said with his hands held out, as if he had no idea what this young little prick was thinking.
They don't belong here.
He sighed heavily. These animals?
All of it. Even me, boy.
Where is your home then, if not here? Chiron asked.
Very far away, and yet so close.
The old man dropped his head and looked down at his feet for a moment, before he glanced to the books across the room, then back to Chiron.
Boy, you already know enough. Go home, wherever that might be. Let me do my work so I can find my own way. Get out of here,
he said as he stiffened his arm and pointed to the door. Maybe we can help each other, Chiron pressed.
There ain't no helping me, boy. I'm a man just living on false hope. Now get your scrawny ass out of here before I mess you up worse than an enraged Elcorador.
Elcador? Those are a myth, old man, Chiron retaliated. The old man was taken aback, but only for a moment as he narrowed his eyes.
Don't make your way back here, boy, or I'll make you regret it with your life.
Is that what happened to the others?
What others?
The old man nearly shouted. Before me, those who were sent on the investigation for the Continental Divide.
Look, you stubborn jackass. I don't even know where the hell I am, but thanks for the note. I don't know how many years behind on arriving home. Go home or I'll force you to leave.
Chiron felt an unusual increase and switched. What are you going to do, old man?
I've sent you into your own worst nightmares. Now you'll never wake up. Boy. Now run! Run!
Chiron stood where he was and felt both a steadiness in his own body and the confidence of knowing he could overpower the stubborn coot. But he also felt something else. Something else was there that he was not familiar with. Considering he was in a jungle of endangered and prehistoric beings, he knew this feeling would always remain. But something seemed to spike this in him. It felt not right. It felt wrong. Evil. Unholy even. In this house, no. In this room was a force that he needed to get away from. He needed to flee, and it was everything in his instinct screaming for him to do. Like a 13-year-old going out with their older friends, thinking it was cool, and yet, when the dealer grew angry, felt the whiplash of the rage that flowed from those that could not withstand the blow that they claimed they could, and with ease. Chiron stood, frozen, staring at the man with glowing blue eyes, and asked himself if he could actually make it out of here if he were to run for it. Was it the old man? He was old, sure, but this didn't mean that he was not dangerous. Seniors never seem dangerous, but when they are ruthless as they come. They are cold-hearted, cold-blooded, and absolutely fierce creatures from a compassionless time where an eye for an eye was law and not a phrase. All of those ancient sayings were not just nursery rhymes, but true stories and warnings. When it seems silly to the future generations, but when those future generations are faced with it, it seems as though they had more astronomical power in them than today's landwalkers. More than today's adults. More than today's children. More than today's people. What if we can help each other out? Chiron asked lowly.
What the hell can you do for me?
The old man asked as he crossed his arms. I don't know yet. I don't know your situation, but I might be able to. I'm a straight-A student.
What's that even mean?
The old man seemed like he was beginning to lose his temper again already. Straight-A student? It's where you're at the top of your class or the most intelligent.
Huh, you don't say, eh?
The old man mumbled as he scratched his chin. It was then Chiron saw a silver band on the man's finger. He had mentioned he had a wife, but it felt much more real seeing it on his hand.
What you know of time?
Time. It's the past, present, and future, ongoing, pushing forward.
Not that, boy. Blending time. What you know of it?
Kyron stared at the man as he furrowed his brow. Time rips and such? That's just a myth.
Hell it is. And until I figure it out how to make another, I ain't getting home.
You made a time rip? Kyron breathed.
I used the time rip for work, boy. I was a traveling salesman, but now I can't get home,
he said as he pointed to the latch in the floor. Why is it frozen?
I'm assuming another time rip. My homeland never experienced such a blizzard in a millennia. If I could make another, I could go back before it happened and get my family out, or find a way to keep that one from letting that blizzard in my homeland from even opening. I'm paying the price for meddling with things I shouldn't have. My family has now paid the price too.
They might be safe. They may have left.
Doubtful. My wife was a stubborn jackass, and my son, well, he always did the best he could, but he sure had no luck with anything. Knowing him, he likely was the one who brought that misfortune upon him. But my wife would have never left the house. She would have waited on me until she was sure I wasn't coming home. But at that point, it would have been too late for them to even leave.
How long have you been here, in this land? Kyron inquired.
Boy, I would have been here long enough to become an old man, do research, set up a home, and then be taken by some random swamp that came up overnight. Too dangerous to try and make anything else now, though. This force has been growing more violent every day. The Umbra is always watching me, and...
Kyron held his hand out with his mouth gaping open. Hold on, did you say Umbra?
Aye.
The old man seemed much too calm for Kyron's nerves. Is it real? Kyron looked at the old man as he gazed back at Kyron with thoughtfulness on whether or not he wished to answer. Placing his hands on his hips, he looked down to his feet and then around the room slowly as if he were pondering on something difficult to understand. Something that needed clear thinking.
Son, you'd be better off getting eaten in the woods than spending any more time with me. My time runs much shorter than you can imagine, and I have a God to pray to before I depart. Not only this world, but them all.
He moved his eyes back to Kyron, and this felt like the only time that he had given him a true look. The lurking shadow, is it real? Kyron asked again. He must know. This thing kept on cropping up, and it must have been some sort of significance to it. Why would it be sitting in the back of his mind asking for more space and then pushing its way just a bit further when he had his back turned? Why not? But why?
Yeah, it is. Now leave me. It's coming for me. I can feel the air shifting.
If it's a shadow creature, isn't it nocturnal?
Nay, it is a creature of no sleep. It prowls in the day and night, by day shifting in each shadow. It's a shapeshifter that mimics any and all.
Seems like there's an awful lot of mimics here. Where did it come from? Kyron's fingers began to tingle as the anticipation of waiting on the true answer to the itching question he had to know for what felt longer than his lifetime.
Have you heard of the in-between?
The old man sighed. Only in myth.
I assumed as much. I have very little time to tell you, but I will share some knowledge with you. Hopefully you can benefit from this before my departure.
Kyron sat himself down on the floor and crossed his legs as the old man did the same.
Long ago, whatever time this is much more advanced than my era. I had been in a traveling salesman business for a while. My former occupation was dabbling. Your face says you don't know what that is, so I'll tell you. It's what is commonly known as magic. I don't know if that's still practiced or even around, but I became fairly well at it. I didn't tell my wife for some time until one day she found where I was keeping my tools and my books. She asked me what it was, and so, as her husband, I was obligated to tell her. Surprisingly, she accepted it with little emotion. No excitement, no disappointment, seeming as though she was indifferent to it. When I asked her how she felt about it, she said she didn't care either way. When we were expecting our first offspring, we decided to leave it as my occupation as a traveling salesman, nothing more. I'd considered teaching them when they came of age, but then thought better of it, as it always dangerous, if not handled with care. It was more commonly seen as an evil practice by the common folk who didn't understand it. They'd destroy your property, kill your crops and cattle, rape and maim your children, as well as your spouse, burn your house down. They'd cut off your hands, your feet, lips, and tie you to a tree and left for dead. It was not ideal to pass this along to family. My blood.
I took some of your books and photos. I didn't know anybody lived here or even in the forest. I'm very sorry. I'll return them to you.
What exactly do you take?
Well, I investigated the room on the right first when entering the cabin. Kyron gestured to the other room. I took what looked like journals and 2 books, but I could not read anything in them. They were written in a language I'd never seen before.
You'll likely never come across it again either. It's an ancient language, as you may have well guessed. Those books I tried to recreate when I discovered I couldn't go back home. But I didn't also keep a journal. One of them books I began when I saw these new creatures prowling about. I wanted to learn more about them. Where they came from, what they were, and what they did, how dangerous they were, etc. You may as well keep them since I won't be needing them no more.
How do you know that you won't survive?
'Cause when you're marked by the lurking shadow, your days are numbered.
You said it's from the in-between. How do you know of it? Have you been there before?
I've not. I've never wished to go there. It's a place worse than the Lake of Fire, or hell as you folk call it here.
How do you know about it, though, if you've never been?
How'd you know about this place before you came? Resources and those who researched before you? Knowledge is passed down from generation to generation. The in-between is essentially a void filled with dark matter. If you don't know what dark matter is, it's particles that do not reflect, emit, or absorb light. It's like wind. You can't see it, but you can see the effects of the wind. I'm not going to go much deeper into how we know it's there, if we can only see the effects of it. As time runs short, and it does not matter. However, the lurking shadow came from the in-between, and there are many other evil things that reside in there, but they cannot be seen nor observed unless released from the in-between. It was due to a grave error I made when creating a time rip on my last journey. Alas, the last time I did this was long ago. Your world reacts strangely to my body. It's aged me so slowly that I cannot even say how long I have even truly been here.
How old were you when you got here? Kyron asked, feeling like a child now.
'Twas 45. How many days does a year count here?
365. 366 for like every 4 years. It's what we call leap year.
By the gods.
Wolfram sighed. As he lifted his eyes to Kyron, his eyes were glassy and red.
I've been here for hundreds of years.
Kyron had no words, but only stared at Wolfram. Being alone for this long and in an unknown place, grieving a family he had murdered by sheer mistake, and trying to overcome his mistakes and make it back home. Hundreds of years of this. Wolfram, I just recalled something I had taken. It was a small lockbox that was in a drawer in the other room. What was in that? I couldn't find a key for it.
'Twas a failure at recreating the item I needed to complete the time rip. I was able to make the latch door work, but couldn't get inside because of sheer cold. After it was created, I opened it and the ice hit my face. I watched it crawl up the passage that led in the basement, quickly shut it, and watched the door freeze over within seconds. It would have worked if the blizzard hadn't come. I'd be back home. My family would still be alive.
Maybe I can help make it work. I can run back and...
Don't waste your time, boy. With no knowledge of dabbling and my time running so short, there's no chance of making it work.
What if I tried anyway?
I can't stop you, but you'll be cursed if you look into the eyes of the Lenten of Umbra, the lurking shadow, whatever you wish to call it.
That does not mean I will, though, Kyron said confidently. Wolfram studied the boy and wondered if he was out of his mind or simply stupid. Likely both, he assumed. Perhaps he was a chance that Wolfram should take.
Fine, boy, your name?
Chiron.
Alright, Karen, run. If you think there's a chance, run as fast as you can.
Chiron stood from his seat and stopped at the door as he turned back to Wolfram. If this is the last time we meet, I'm glad I got to meet you.
Get the hell out of here, boy. Don't give me no sentimental bullshit. Run!
Chiron turned around without another word and left. Wolfram gazed out the window in the room and wondered if the boy would be back in time. Even if he were, what were the odds of this actually working? Little to none. A chance to see his family once more was a chance worth taking, even if it meant Chiron losing his own life in the process. The boy would die out in these woods anyway. Might as well make it to where he isn't maimed or mauled to death. The sun would set within a few hours. Perhaps Chiron would stay around after nightfall if the demon did not come before then. Odds were that it would, but this was not the only time it had gotten him on his toes and gaslighting him to no end. But this time felt final. Chiron arrived at the facility out of breath and covered in sweat. He jerked the door open as he panted heavily before stopping in his tracks. Wait, I'm helping someone to get home who has caused such a mess. Is he going to clean it up too? Am I going to die doing this? He did not ponder long on the thought, walking quickly into his room, gathering the photos, books, and the small lockbox, shoving it into his bag, and briskly making his way back out the door. He was nearly 3/4 of the way back. His stomach protested as he peered up through the thick canopy of trees. It was nearing the evening. He would need to eat something soon, and all he had were a few protein bars to make it until tomorrow morning if he rationed them. Then another thought came. What if the man was dead already when he got back? What then? Continue through the woods and try to make it to the other side? It was almost like a side quest, he thought to himself as he smirked. The main quest seemed to be pretty interesting until a side quest came along, and it was the main goal for the time being. The man claimed his time was short, so this should not take long, Chiron considered as he pressed forward to return to the decrepit cabin. Chiron stepped back through the front door of the cabin and made his way back to the doorless frame as his eyes grew wide. He stepped quickly to the side and watched from the side of the doorway at Wolfram with his back facing Chiron. In front of Wolfram stood a ghostly-like darkness, where a strange waft of black smoke seemed to be seething from the silhouette of a person. Its claws were long and sharp, curled near Wolfram's head, but not quite touching it. Its head seemed to have been splintered but remained intact, and gave a jagged pulsating motion, with two solid white eyes that appeared to be staring directly at Wolfram's. It did not seem that Chiron had made his appearance known.
Now listen, please, let me restore you. I promise I can. Just hear me out. Tell me you can understand me, Carm. Please, hear me.
Wolfram said as he took a single step back. The lurking shadow turned its head slightly and took one forward step towards Wolfram. Its claws remained curled near his head and close.
Please, tell me you can understand what I'm saying. Please,
Wolfram begged. His voice was beginning to break, and he was visibly shaking.
Carmen, can you hear me?
Carmen. Why does that sound familiar? Chiron thought.
Please don't hurt me!
A girl's voice cried. As the sound reached Chiron's ears, the shadow's head moved rapidly, as did the splintered pieces.
Please stop, Mom, where are you?
Wolfram flinched each time the girl's voice cried out. He took 2 steps back and fell backward, knocking the wind out of him. The shadow leaned down over him and lowered its head, appearing to glare at him.
What's happening to me? Help!
Please, stop. I'm sorry for what happened to you. I'm sorry.
Wolfram choked. The shadow tilted its head again, and a low guttural growl came from it, mixed with the girl's whine.
Let me make it right. I've been working so hard to make it right. I need more time. Please, give me more time. I know it's been this long, but I promise I can make things right.
Stop! It hurts so bad!
She squalled. The splintered blackness looked like shards of lead rapidly firing off but never leaving the head, as the sounds reverberated off the walls. Kyron grabbed one of his flashbangs from his bag, quickly pulled the pin from it, and threw it directly at the shadow. It looked up at him just before it went off as Kyron ducked away behind the wall. Immediately, his head rang, as did his ears, with such a high-pitched frequency squeal that he felt himself trying to retch. The cabin, though the floor was already tilted anyway, seemed to tilt even further as Kyron began sliding on the soggy moss and into the slimy waters at the further end of the cabin. He stopped himself by taking hold of the door frame with merely the tip of his boots touching the algae floating atop. Pulling himself back up from the door, he found his grounding again, but his head throbbed fiercely. He still could barely see, but his vision was beginning to return, as his sights could only see blurs of blackness. Thankfully, those things did not last too long, but it should have lit up the room enough to knock out any way a shadow could remain. Even Wolfram should not be able to produce a shadow from himself when it went off, hopefully eradicating any way the shadow could have taken shelter in it, or anything in the room. Kyron peered in the room to see Wolfram turned face down with his arms over his head. The ringing continued as he let out a gurgling cry before spewing yellow liquid on the floorboards. Kyron's lip curled as he stepped around and reached to help Wolfram up. Wolfram turned rapidly towards Kyron with tears flowing down his face and bile dripping down his chin. He had not seen such a pathetic scene since he himself had looked in the mirror over a year ago. Sick, afraid, and bewildered. Wolfram grabbed Kyron's shirt as he stood on his wobbling legs, drawing close to Kyron's face.
Where is she? Where'd she go?
She? Kyron asked.
The Umbra, boy! Where is she?
Wolfram hissed. I set a flashbang off in here. I thought since it had such high mega candelas that... Wolfram released Kyron's shirt, falling backward into the floor as he stared at the ceiling. His limbs trembled, as did his lips.
I thought I had died,
he whispered. What is she? I heard you speaking to her. Wolfram continued breathing heavily as he turned his head slowly to look at Kyron. He stared at the boy a moment before closing his eyes and turning back to face the ceiling again. Wolfram, I know you just went through a traumatic experience, as did I, but you need to get out of here. There's no way we can stay the night here. It'll come back. Your candles are no good for us. We need to move. Now. Kyron stared at Wolfram as he sighed loudly before turning and looking at Kyron.
Boy, I don't even want to live anymore. I don't know how to fix her. I don't even know where to start.
I didn't waste a flashbang on some suicider. You're coming back with me. You have some explaining to do, even if you decide to let yourself die. You know things I need to know.
Why should I?
Wolfram sneered. Don't you want your family back? Wolfram looked away from Kyron and sighed again before getting himself to his feet.
It's getting late. How long of a walk is it back to your shelter?
It's about an hour and a half just walking. We need to pick it up.
Alright, let's get moving then.
Wolfram agreed as he took an old, tattered leather bag and swung it over his shoulder. They waded through the swamp and then come to more solid ground as Wolfram gazed up.
I don't think we'll make it, Kyron.
The hell we will, come on, Kyron said sternly. In the pit of his stomach, he felt an unease that lingered on. Why don't we use this time to talk?
Ask away, I suppose.
You said Carmen to that thing. It has a name? Kyron inquired, glancing at Wolfram, to see him look down to his feet as they walked on.
Yeah, she did. You see, you know of the time rips I told you about when I traveled and one seemed to randomly open and unleash the icy hell upon my home? When I was dabbling, trying to find out more when I got here, I ended up locating a high energy that was so great that it was, I thought it was an impossible. Before, at least. But then, upon finding the source through the watery glass...
Hold on, watery glass? Kyron questioned.
You don't know nothing, do you?
Wolfram pulled his haggard face down before looking to Kyron, then back ahead again.
A watery glass is where you cast a certain dabble on a liquid surface, you see, elsewhere. There was a folklore in my time of those who used solid balls made from crystal to do the same thing. Myth, but sounds awfully convenient. Well, I located the source and watched something horrific. Probably the most horrific thing I ever did see.
What was it exactly? Kyron asked.
I saw this girl probably around the age of 7, running away from her parents' house. Terrible parents, might I add. I was able to see some snippets of her memories when this was all going on. Never had something like that happen before, but it did, and I got no clue why. Anyway, she ran into this forest and then this little cave. Within minutes, she fell asleep. Almost right away, this shadow-like creature, kinda like the one you saw but not quite so developed, it came about the cave and looked in. It started talking to her, you see. He cast something on her, causing her to see illusions. Looked like 'twas daytime already. It lured her out of the cave and to this nearby pond. There was some kind of carcass lying near the pond. Couldn't tell you what it were, as I'd never seen such a creature with large spiked horns, and its belly was already bloated and torn open. I watched him gesture to it several times before she knelt and dug her hands in, shoveling maggots and rotten meat in her mouth. I nearly vomited watching the whole thing, but I had to find out what was going on and why such immense power was here. It didn't make sense. I knew it was connected to this basic-looking shadow, about the size of a small boy, probably around her age. The rotten blood were all over her front and her mouth when I could see her face again. The shadow smiled and gestured her to the pond for a cleanup, I suppose. So she got in after he was already standing in the middle of the pond. Wasn't deep, I suppose. He held his hand out for her, and then was when she realized something was up. I could feel the emotion coming from the watery glass, and that had never happened before neither. It was the queerest thing I'd ever experienced.
So what happened next? Kyron inquired.
Well,
Wolfram sighed.
I couldn't tell you what she saw, but she saw something in the water. She looked down and screamed as she ran back on shore with the shadow's hand still extended to her. She started fighting with something right about the time that she reached the shore, like something was round around her legs, thrashing and such. When she finally freed herself of whatever it was, she ran. She realized that she had eaten a dead animal and started heaving, but never stopped running. The poor thing. But then, something happened I never expected.
What?
As she ran, there was a strange ore that she didn't seem to see right in front of her. She ran into it, and it brought her right back behind the pond.
It brought her back to the pond?
That's right. She ran and ran again. The fear coming from the water glass was so intense I had to back away and light myself a smoke, along with a nice large swig of fermented grain.
You mean vodka?
Whatever you wish to call it. We used it for medicine and to ease those who were in pain or anxious. So anyway, I'm watching, but not quite as close as before. I can still see it clearly, though. Well, she ran and ran. Little thing was visibly exhausted, but she pressed on. The final run-through she gave, she ran straight into the shadow. This thing has its arms wide open, and as soon as she was within reach, it snatched her immediately. And it
what? Kyron pressed.
It did an intricate motion that I had not seen in dabbling, nor could I ever repeat it. As it did, a hole opened up with darkness. A blackness that was the deepest and darkest black that I had ever laid my eyes upon. Even a pitch-black cellar in the middle of the night had nothing compared to this. The power intensified greatly as I realized it was opening up the in-between. Something I never imagined could be done. I've read of many dabblers who attempted but always failed, costing them their lives. No one survives it. And yet this shadow creature, the size of a little boy, opened it with the most advanced gesture with little effort. It was then I realized it was dark matter. I won't go much into that, but he did another gesture. Her head leaned back suddenly, almost hard enough to seem like it had broken it. The little girl's iris went away, only leaving the pupil. Then the pupil vanished, leaving behind solid white glassy eyes. I could hear an echoing scream coming from the water glass and saw something strange entering the hole, coming from the girl's mouth. Now, I'd never seen a soul, but I knew it was hers. Her soul was sucked right out of her body and forced into the in-between. As soon as the tail end of it disappeared, the shadow began disintegrating into this black mist and began flowing into the girl's mouth. Her eyes began glowing, and before the mist had completely taken over and eaten her, more came pouring out of the rip it created. Her body convulsed, this little girl who had lived such a terrible life, only to have her soul thrown into something far worse than hell, and then to have her body invaded by abominations that are from the unknown. And before the hole closed, I could hear her screaming from the blackness. I had no clue how she could scream without a physical body, but she did. And what you walked into is the same thing she screamed, like an echo, continuously crying out for help.
She cried for her mom, Karen mentioned lowly.
She did, boy, she did,
Wolfram choked.
I did to this poor girl.
Wait, but how? You said no one has been able to open the in-between without death. So how did that thing get it here if you did not open it? Wolfram furrowed his brow, then looked to Chiron sternly.
I don't rightly know.
So where did that thing come from? Another dimension or time that was not from the in-between? Chiron inquired. Can they open it on their own?
I reckon they can, is my only guess. The random rips and sources of power only happened after the mistake I made, so perhaps the random time rips have caused this in-between gateway to weaken enough to let the creatures out.
Are they creatures? What are they?
Honestly, I don't know. They look like a shadow, and react to light as a shadow does, just goes away.
Wolfram waved his hand up lazily, then dropped it back.
Living shadows seem like a child's tale to keep children from wandering off in the woods.
They have made movies about such things. They're called horror films, where someone's shadow becomes sentient.
What's a film?
It's like a story, but almost as if you're watching it in real life, but not. It's like an echo, in a way, I guess. Recording things that happened so that they could be rewatched afterward. Most of the time they're fictional, though, not real.
That sounds fascinating.
Chiron had almost forgotten before answering him that Wolfram was from a different time and place. Films did not exist in his world. He had nearly laughed at Wolfram's question before the realization hit him. So, do you think that these creatures or shadows or whatever they are becoming sentient? I mean, how did they even come about? Chiron asked.
That I don't know. There's little information on them, other than knowledge of their existence from ancient scripts.
Chiron rolled his eyes.
What's your problem?
It's such a common theme for mystery and horror films, fantasy especially. Someone finds an ancient scroll with forbidden knowledge and blah blah blah.
They make films about that too, huh? Interesting,
Wolfram said as he rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Why do you say that?
Well, how do they know about this stuff to even make the film on it? Surely they knew about it to be true if they made a film about it and it being so spot on.
Well, the stories are all different. The writers and authors of it, I'm sure, used their imagination and probably had no actual knowledge of it being a real thing elsewhere.
You sure about that?
Wolfram asked.
I'm here.
I can't see you becoming a writer of a movie.
No, that's beyond my comprehension, but that doesn't mean that there weren't other dabblers who have crossed there before, and perhaps they shared their experiences, giving them the idea.
Chiron nodded his head to the side in agreement as he raised his brows. He never considered finding another person in the Continental Divide. Better yet, someone from another place and time who practiced magic. It was an insane thought, and asked himself if he was lucid or intoxicated by something, causing him to hallucinate. That was much more plausible. As he thought on this, he gazed up and noticed it was nearing sundown, and they still had a little ways to go. Wolfram, I think it's best we pick up the pace. It's close to dusk now, Chiron advised. Wolfram glanced up and raised his brow.
Huh. Time hasn't flown this fast in a long time for me.